Hey, this is Stuchiu here, and today I wanted to talk a bit about G2 from G2's performance at the ESL Pro League Season 9 group stages. And basically, if you don't know, group stages for the EPL season started, and in Group C, they basically have a group of death because they have Navi, Fnatic, G2, and Wendigo, and obviously each team has like an extra like third or fourth team that's not as good as the like best teams in the group. And I think Wendigo is probably the best of like these extraneous teams because I think they've shown like pretty legit upsets in recent history. So I thought this was a pretty tough group. And what's interesting is G2 basically came out on top because if I hadn't seen the results and somebody asked me beforehand what I think was going to happen, I'd probably say Navi 1, Fnatic 2, G2 3 is probably how I'd have gone. And then it's basically G2's is first, Navi second, Fnatic 3. And there's a lot of tactical and strategic stuff I wanted to go over, but I'm just going to pare it down to a few specific maps in general because I think these are the ones that kind of give you an idea of the strategy and the thought processes behind, or at least what I think are what the strategy, the thought processes are behind what G2 is currently doing with the roster and what their identity kind of is veering towards. So I'll start on the on the highest level, which is basic strategy, right? And what I mean by strategy is what is the core concept of how G2 wants to win games. And in order to figure that out, you have to figure out, at least on paper, who you think are the best players that are most consistently going to deliver for you. And in GT's case, it's always been the same idea: Kenny S and Shocks, right? And I think in this particular G2, their primary condition is actually just Kenny S right now. And they do this both tactically and strategically in the map veto. So if you look at the map vetoes against both Fnatic and Navi, all right, it's a little bit hard to prove it because I think in both series, I think it's actually legitimately the best answer for G2 to pick Nuke first, just because I don't think Navi's Nuke is particularly good anymore. I'm not even certain if it was that good in the past. I actually think they were leaning heavily on Simple in their previous iterations when they played Nuke, but regardless of that, against Fnatic, I think it's a pretty good choice against Fnatic because I think it does limit a lot of what makes JW. I think Twist himself is probably not as good at that map. Like I don't think, like in terms of free flow, free for all, like Fnatic style, like Nuke's never really fit them as never really fit that particular squad, this current one. So it makes a lot of sense, at least on a theoretical level, just to pick Nuke against both of them. What's interesting, though, is that I think it also emphasizes Kenny S as an opper, because I think if you're talking about oppers on Nuke, there's only really three great ones. There's Device, Kenny S, and Simple. And I'm not even certain Simple is necessarily a great one. I just think in Simple's case, he's like so mechanically good anyway, and he has such good game sense that I don't necessarily know if he's that great on it just because the sample size isn't great for Navi and Simple and all that stuff. But I know for certain both Device and Kenny have understood and really mastered this map. And so that's why I think strategically, at least in the map veto, G2 were certainly trying to favor towards a Kenny S based play. And then what's interesting is you actually see it specifically in the games. And the 4 games I'm going to go over is Fnatic on Inferno, and then the entire Navi series. And the reason I'm not going over the Wendigo series is just because I think it's harder to extrapolate information from a series where they technically didn't have to try everything, like basically Navi's Kane, their coach Kane, basically said, oh, since this last match doesn't matter, we're going to experiment or whatever, right? And then I think the same can be said for G2 because I think G2 had already secured their first place seed. So that's why I'm focusing more on the Fnatic and Navi games. And what's interesting about Inferno is basically, if you look at the T side, they are really trying to get Kenny S into the action. It's just like, I don't think any team's done this in the world. Like, even Navi with Simple, they don't actually force Simple to take first action a lot of the times. Like, mostly they try to bait him into spots. What I mean by that is, like, Zeus and Electronic will fight for B Halls. I mean, not B Halls, Banana. And once they do that, then they'll let, like, Simple loose, or they'll take top mid, and then they'll do, like, the Zeus style of calling or whatever, Zeus style of tactics. In this particular match, I'm not exactly certain why. Actually, I have ideas as to why they did it, but I can't be certain. But basically, with Kenny S, he's aggressively taking picks throughout the entire map. So he starts off in, like, Boiler Room, like trying to get a pick with an op. So he's trying to get a pick there. Later on, he's, like, rushing top mid, trying to get a pick on, I assume it's JW he's thinking he's going to try to get a pick on. And then other times you see him rushing down Banana by himself, trying to get a pick there. And so what this kind of tells me is that G2 recognized the fact that Kenny S is their most consistent option for getting for getting picks on their T sides, and they're emphasizing that even on Inferno, which is kind of not an op map. And it kind of makes me happy, because even though they, meta-wise, you shouldn't be doing this, strategically with the personnel they have, I think this is clearly the best choice, especially against Fnatic, who don't have an equivalent opera on their side. Like, Twist is good at holding an angle, sure, and then JW is quite good at his wild card playstyle, sure, but I think both of them are just like half of what Kenny S is. Like, you have to add them both together to equal one Kenny S or whatever. And I don't think they're as consistent as he can be, and they certainly don't reach his ceiling. So I think, at least strategically, this was a fantastic choice by G2, and tactically it made a lot of sense. And then let's move on to the next part. What was it? Oh, the CT side. So the CT side is actually quite similar, in the sense that they're trying to emphasize Kenny S. And I forget the exact round. Maybe I'll go back and look for it. But basically, whenever G2 take banana control, they realize that if you take banana control, then your only other options are really apps control or top mid, right? And if Fnatic take top mid, generally what happens is Kenny S will aggressively take that op duel against whoever is coming out and try to get a pick that way. And that's how they're trying to win the rounds. Is basically, as far as I can tell, CT side-wise, they're using a lot of their utility. They're using a lot of other positions to try to funnel Fnatic into Kenny S's op, so Kenny S can get the early pick, and then they can play the power play situation from there. So, like I said, it seems like a very, at least for this Inferno map, I don't know if this is going to continue, but it seems like a very Kenny S-centric map, and I'm quite happy to see this, because I think he is their win condition. So I think Malik, let me check. I'm pretty sure Malik is the coach. So I think strategically he's doing a pretty good job if he came up with that idea. Or maybe it's Shox, or maybe it's Omnic, because I'm not exactly certain how everything's coming together in that team. Now, as for the Navi series, this one's pretty interesting for a number of reasons, because strategically this is a much harder team to play against if you're trying to just run like 4 protect Kenny S or whatever, because Simple is a better opera than Kenny S. Like, I don't think that's surprising to anybody that I have that opinion. I'm pretty sure everybody has this opinion right now. Is like, Simple's the best player in the world. He's arguably the best op. I think he transcends the op in a sense. I think he plays more simple than the op, but whatever the case is, like, I think I was very curious as to how they were going to play this one out, because at least in my mind, I didn't think they had a good. G2 didn't really have good. Basically, if you think about it strategically, Kenny S running into Simple is a bad option, but it's your best option. You're just running Kenny S into the team. So how were they going to deal with this particular issue? And I didn't think they could. So I didn't watch it live, but like, I looked at the results, like, oh wow, they upset Navi. Rewatched the VODs, and I think G2 did a prepared pretty smart for this. What's that? Prepared pretty well. It's not smart. Pretty well for this particular series if you're talking about strategy and tactics. So let's start with the T side, right? And first map was Nuke. I think here's what I think happened. They do still have confidence that KNES can fight simple head to head. So in one of the early rounds, they start off with that idea. Is that they're like, okay, let's see if KNES can fight simple head on. Simple wins the duel because he's simple, right? And then what's interesting is G2 aren't particularly stubborn, and I think this is like a testament to either to KNES or to the coach or to the leaders. We're like, okay, well that didn't work. Let's go to plan B, or maybe this was plan A, and then KNES is plan B, but plan B worked. Like you just stick with the KNES plan, right? Whatever the case is. And then their next plan is basically they are going to use their utility to take map control. Generally, the typical yard smokes. They might use like the triple, the bifurcation smokes. That's what I call them. Basically, you split yard in half, and then you have access to either main and garage, and then you can either lurk through towards CT spawn, and hell and heaven, whatever, or you can like split. Like those are generally the two smokes I saw them use, and I guess they also use the the hell main garage smokes too. But basically, once they take map control, what's interesting about this team, and I'm not certain as to. Basically, I'm not certain if this is like a consistent playstyle with them or if this was specific to deal with Na'Vi. But basically, when they took map control, they do a pause and then they kind of split up the team as far as possible. And what I mean by that is when, in general, most T sides run generally 1-3-1, 2-2-1, or potentially 4-1. In this particular matchup, when G2 got map control, they were splitting into 4 or 5 prongs instead. So there was like 1-1-1-1-1 or 1-1-1-2-1, something crazy like that. Or not sure I counted that right. 1-1-2-1. It's better, right? And basically, the whole point of doing that is, at least in terms of playstyle, it makes a lot of sense. Because if you look at Shox and Amanek and Lucky, all of them are types of lurkers. Like obviously Shox is versatile enough that he can literally do everything. But Amanek, the best aspects of his game I saw from LDLC when they made their run back in I forget the exact tournament, when they made that surprising run where everybody's like, oh look, they're the best French team, and then they never did anything afterwards. That run, basically when you watch that, basically Amanek is a very strong lurker. He's actually quite similar to Old Happy in that sense, but he's a bit more aggressive. He has a bit more impact, and he's certainly way better in the 3v3 situations now than Happy is currently, right? And then Shox himself, and then Lucky is a passive support lurker. What I mean by that is like he basically just holds an angle, and like he lets the other side dictate it, because he understands, at least I think on a theoretical level, that he isn't the one making the plays, but he is the one who has to do the same role every round, every game, so that everybody else knows what he's going to do, and then they don't have to worry about that specific area. And what makes this an interesting sort of here's the reason why I can't figure out if it's a playstyle thing or if it's specifically prepared for Na'Vi, is because Na'Vi have a really bad tendency of using Edward as like a vanguard CT side player to push hut and then push into lobby. And so you see this like 2 or 3 times throughout this particular match, where because G2 are running this like very like prong heavy like deep map control style, Na'Vi gets antsy. Na'Vi wants information. Edward is the guy they'll push out to get that information, and then Lucky will kill him because Edward is a particularly mechanically strong player, and then he'll win that duel. Right, and then from there, G2 can do a split to the A side or B side, and that's kind of how G2 have been playing this particular matchup, and on Nuke, and this kind of style, like very I guess you want to call it lurk heavy, except they have like two or three, like they basically have two or three lurks, I guess, depending on how you want to categorize that term. It's very, it runs through their team. Now, what's interesting was their CT side. I think their CT side was actually a lot better than their T side, because even though like I've talked a lot about their T side, I still think they could. I still think at times like their T side didn't really come together as much as it could have or theoretically should have at times. But I mean, that's just simple for you. As for CT side, here's the thing. I think basically, remember what I talked about, how Kenny S, like, he tried to take that duel early on against Simple and then fell off. Same thing I think happens on the CT side. He tries to take a yard and then falls off. But what's interesting is, like, because Kenny S is so versatile, he actually takes a bunch of positions where Simple isn't in play. And the biggest one I saw throughout that match was him like pushing ramp room with his op and trying to get a pick that way, because Simple doesn't hold that angle. Like, Simple holds for yards, Simple holds for secrets. Simple's on the opposite side of the map. So this is a very like clever way to emphasize your own strength while avoiding Simple. And obviously this is basically what most teams try to do when they face off against Na'Vi anyways. Like, you don't want to feed Simple, you want to go after the weak underbelly of the Na'Vi players, at least if you're trying to play an individual like dual heavy style, which was kind of what happened here. And what's interesting is basically the play before the play, because I think the reason Kenny S is allowed to do this is because Shox is kind of frustrating the map control around the yard. And generally the way Na'Vi have been playing around that is, it's not particularly creative, but basically they just throw that smoke. They do that first smoke near the boxes, and then Electronic like jumps up and then just starts looking for a duel, right? And then in order to counter this, basically G2 is like, oh, we just throw smoke in front of that, so Electronic doesn't have really good information out there, and he can't really call anything or clear anything. And that forces a lot of different things. Like in the first round, basically, Shox kind of reads that if you do that, first rifle round on the G2C side, Shox kind of reads that if you do that particular smoke and Electronic can't get information, the obvious answer then is you just send somebody up on silo, try to get information out there, and then Shox with his AUG kills that guy and then backs off. And basically, what's smart about this, at least from a strategic and tactical point of view, is because Na'Vi love to run down the clock, because Na'Vi love that map control, you're just adding so much extra time at the first step, because if you get that first smoke nade out from G2, Na'Vi will have to clear out so many angles later on that most teams naturally get by default because they get to clear it out to begin with. So it's quite smart, and it lets Shox play a very aggressive CT sided role, where he's kind of like him and Kenny S are kind of in simpatico, at least on the CT side of Nuke, where both of them get to be very aggressive. Both of them get to make a lot of plays. And what's interesting is how the corollary parts kind of play around that, because both Amanek and might have been Jax. Yeah, Amanek and Jax, like, they're kind of like the rising young stars of this squad, but obviously they can't be that in this map and generally strategically. But both of them do get interesting roles to play, because they kind of rotate off of the information Shox and Kenny S get, or the plays they get. So pretty interesting stuff for them, at least on Nuke. And then we go to Train, and Train is basically the Jax map, as far as I can tell, for G2. Like, basically, their default, I think G2's default, if they can get to it, because I think this is something that Shox has always had a inherent problem with, is they want to run a double op setup as their primary, as like their primary go-to setup for the CT side. And while that's pretty strong in general, I just don't think Shox is a consistent enough opper to warrant the risk reward here, because you're basically putting in a lot of money to get that secondary op. But the reason I call this a Jax map is because I think this is the map where he gets let off the leash the most, and he makes like the most aggressive entry style plays. He gets a lot of impact in general. And what's interesting is like after three maps of watching this G2, what's interesting about Shox is he's basically taking he's like half support and half star. What I mean by that is on the CT side, I still think he's a star player. I still think he gets pretty good positions. I still think he gets high frag positions, high impact positions. But if you look at the T side, he's basically playing similarly to MSL. Because obviously he's like a super powered version of MSL. Basically, he's trying to he's kind of let go of the idea of him being like a heavy lurk player, as far as I can tell. And instead, he's playing like the map. He's playing for map control. He's playing as the first man in a lot of the times, whether that's taking map control and trading for whoever's with him at the time, Lucky or Jax or Almanac, and because they play around positionally, right? And in the actual hits, Shox is always the first one to go in, and I think basically, I think at some point, like Happy must have been a fucking genius. And the reason I say that is because, like, even though both MBK and MBK and Shox, like, kicked Happy out and they don't believe in Happy anymore, they still like use a lot of his ideas at times. And this is certainly a Happy idea of using Shox as an entry. And I think it makes a lot of sense just because even though Jax is like a pretty decent entry, like he's not. I think he's a bit too wild to do that map control with like a secondary players type. And so I think it makes a lot of sense for Shox to be doing it, even though I think strategically, here's the thing about G2 basically, is they definitely need somebody else to be doing what Shox is doing, because I think Shox's best role is as lurk, but you can't really find a good French player to do that, and there aren't that, and in general that's just a very hard role. So I guess it makes sense for now for Shox to do it, but I think I think there's going to be a hard ceiling where they're going to need that kind of system is going to run out eventually, and they'll need to find a different answer wherever that is. All right, and then the final map I wanted to talk about, I think, was Overpass, and so Overpass is quite similar to Nuke for G2 in terms of that's a lot of CT side aggression, generally from I think Jax. I think Lucky and Jax, like they push water, they push monster. Kenny S trying to go for picks, and they do a lot of pretty heavy connector setups. So in general, it's pretty good CT side all around. What's interesting though is their T side, because their T side is I think among the different T sides I watched from G2 in this group stage, I think this is the one that gives away the most information about what they think of themselves stylistically as a team. So in general, they want Kenny S to be the free roam aggressive opper looking for picks, and they did this a lot with their T side. But if they get a pick, here's what differentiates them from other teams, I guess, is once they get a pick, they don't pause. And then what I mean by pause is like they don't wait for like the rotations to play out and then they like abuse those rotations. They don't gather up and then execute. So like they don't try to like force their power play advantage. What they do is once they take a pick, they start doing 2-man aggressive lurk entries, generally with Shox +1, depending on what other players with him at the time, right? And the whole point of this, I think, is basically if he runs into a player, if he runs into a 2-man stack, hopefully they'll trade, and then if they trade, they get the information, and then they can make a mid-round rotation to somewhere else, or they can commit to the site. And what's interesting about this is basically this is kind of how LDLC played in that one. I'll just go ahead and look because I keep mentioning it. But basically, this is the kind of style LDLC was playing when they made that weird upset run at IEM Chicago, right? And what's interesting, what's a funny thing to note is that MBK, after Almanac joined G2. MBK kind of on Twitter is like, he's kind of said something like, I swear to God, I think Amanek is calling for that team. And then somebody else like, no, it wasn't Amanek. And then he did that meme post like, press X to doubt, right? But I can kind of see where MBK is coming from, because this is certainly a Amanek style of running the T side, at least from what I saw from the one tournament. I'm not an expert on Amanek or anything, but it makes a lot of sense, at least for G2, because if you think about Shox as a leader and the players they do have a lot of like pretty aggressive lurk styles, lurk players who want to play in like 3v3 small man scenarios, like Shox, Amanek, even Lucky to a certain extent. So I think it makes a good amount of sense to run this style, and it did work against Navi. And so overall, I think this G2 looks pretty good. Like, I've got to give credit to Malik. I wasn't a huge fan of kicking out Existence, but at the same time, Existence wasn't cutting it, and Smiths definitely should have never come back. I think that was like a ridiculous risk everybody took on that one. But outside of that, he has proven basically, like, he has proven at least linear results for this squad since that removal, because basically I don't think Lucky's that good, but he does play his role good enough. So he's clearly doing his system. He's clearly like a system player. I think Jax has turned out to be pretty good. I think, I don't like stats wise, it doesn't look that great, but I think impact wise, I think in terms of role, I think he's been a pretty good fit. And then in terms of strategy, I think a lot of their tactics emphasize their player strengths with Shox, with Amanek, at least mid-round calls. Like, I think Shox is still sacrificing a bit too much, but like, given the pieces they have, given where they are as a team, like, I don't think I can't think of a better alternative. I'll put it that way. Like, I can't think of a better alternative as to how do you play out, how you can get Shox to get him to play the lurking position, but still have the entry strength you need on the hits. Like, I don't think Jax is that kind of player. And they've certainly like focused a lot on Kenny S as an opper, and I still think they used Shox correctly on the CT side. So overall, I'm pretty impressed with this team, at least from where they were to where they are now. My big question for them is, it's not really criticism, it's just more of what their next test is. Because if you look at the way the EPL is set up, any team who is not in the regular LAN circuit, basically Wendigo and G2 in this case, like, these are the teams that get the most advantage in this particular EPL setup, because they get the most time to prepare, they get the most information to watch and counter strat the other teams. And like, I don't think Navi or Fnatic really got that much time to prepare because they were traveling and whatnot, right? So I think we're going to have to see how they look like in an actual LAN tournament where there's a bunch of days, or we're gonna have to see them at a time where like for instance, let's say, basically where they go to a LAN where like there's a pretty good amount of break in between for the top teams to technically have time to study them if they wanted to, and then see how they do there. I think that'll be the real test. But overall, I think G2's been better, and perhaps this reign of terror that has overtaken France will eventually come to an end. We'll see. See you guys later.